But, as it is, but they at least have had choices. And they have some power in that. They can make new choices that are better, but what choice can a child make in that situation? A 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old child.
They have no say.
They have zero say in the matter. They are simply dragged along.
And you could say we pay for that too, because not only financially, but say that kid grows up
Yeah.
messed up because he didn't have the family.
Yeah.
Not an excuse, but it happens. And then he kills one of our kids.
Yep.
or, Yeah,
So,
society.
yeah. So that's where it's not who sinned, it's the general society of sin, the human race of sin causes all this. I was absolutely stunned. I'm going to have to bring that home. I've got a copy at school. They just did a thing of 10 questions. It's a fairly new study. It's come out in the last 5 years, and they're really unpacking it now. And they've gone down through, and there's 10 questions that are asked by the age of I think it's 16. How many of these questions do you answer yes to? Did you ever go to sleep hungry because there was nothing to eat? Yes or no? Did you ever witness someone in the home being accosted with violence? Yes or no? But you get the general idea.
Yeah.
There's 10 of these questions. And I've got to bring it in. I'll run off copies.
I'd
and
love to see
look
that.
at it. What they found was people that have 0 yeses on those 10 questions, 0, have an almost infinitesimal chance of getting cancer. The chance of dying of heart disease is negligible.
Wow.
We talk about diabetes, oh, it's because of obesity. The diabetes for people that have 0 on this is very low. If you have 1, it about doubles from the person who has 0. If you have 2, it about quadruples the people who have 0. If you have 4 or more, it's 8 or 10 times greater
I believe that.
than the person who has 0. Now, ultimately, every one of those 10 things, guess what lies behind them?
Psychological or
A 3-letter word: sin.
Yeah.
Therefore, in a real way, the medical proof is that sin causes disease and death.
wow. Wow.
Literally, factually, not hypothetically, empirically, sin causes it. Not even my own sin, because often as a child, we're not talking about their sin, we're talking about
Someone else's.
their parents' sin, maybe an older sibling's sin
That they've witnessed and
that they've witnessed or been subject to. There were ones about abuse. You've been abused. There were ones about sexual things that you were exposed to sexual abuse, either witnessing sexual acts or having sexual things done to you as a child. Just all of that sin just piles up. And so when the Bible says sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death.
It's true.
Yeah.
in every way.
In every way. Not just, okay, everybody dies because we sin, but sin individual sins bring forth death.
Is there any indication what the original plan was? In that, do we know what period of time between the creation of Adam and Eve, the time that they sinned, and if they had not sinned, were they going to procreate?
Well, we can answer that one. How can we answer that?
Go forth and multiply.
That's in Genesis 1 before sin. That is not a response to sin, that predates sin. From the very beginning of their creation, it was, what's the only command? The only command that God gave that humanity has obeyed. Go forth and be fruitful and multiply. Go out and multiply. We obey that one.
But they hadn't.
Yet. So therefore, what is the probable implication of that?
I don't know.
Well, they would have had a kid because they were.
But the fact that they didn't have any children, what's the most likely interpretation of that?
That it was early.
Oh.
Yeah, that they were not in the garden a huge amount of time. That their time in the garden was not a considerable period of time.
I would think that too, because I think that I think God, he didn't want robots, so he tested them. And there was a certain testing period, and I don't think it would have been that long. You know, it just happened. And
I will admit at this point that I am probably in the minority. And I don't know if that's because people haven't thought this through or because, but I'm gonna say, what were Adam and Eve like in the garden in this perspective? Were Adam and Eve eternal creatures in the Garden of Eden?
No,
I
they
think
hadn't,
yes.
they hadn't eaten the fruit of life yet, and that's why God kicked them out so they wouldn't live forever. He actually said that too.
Oh.
So when you say in the garden, I'm thinking before sinning.
Before
So I
sinning.
would say yes, they
Before
were
sinning.
going to continue to live.
I would think that you're gonna say no.
I'm gonna say no.
Yeah.
I don't think that the eating of the fruit that led to eternal life was a one-time thing. Why were they kicked out of the Garden of Eden?
They transgressed the rule.
But-
couldn't get to it.
So they couldn't get, because they said, God said they'll stretch forth their arm and take the fruit and eat of it and live forever
With sin.
with sin.
Yeah.
When I was first saved, I thought, okay, they take one bite, now they live forever. What if our natural state is exactly what it is today? We age and die.
But
But-
at a slower rate.
But in the garden, there was the
Tree of life.
tree of life that as long as you continue to eat at it, you would never age and die.
Oh, like keep regenerating
Yeah, makes
yourself.
sense.
You would continue to regenerate and it would cancel out any aging or
Well,
dying.
they were at a fully mature level, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So that's all you would do is would reach maturity and never
And stay there.
have you ate. from
Yeah.
things like that. Got a good.
But if I'm right about that,
Mhm.
then this whole thing about death, because what is the death that God threatens from eating the fruit?
Spiritual.
Because you're gonna die.
It is spiritual death, not physical death.
So separation from him.
Because what does God say? What is the punishment that God says for eating the fruit?
You will surely die.
For the what?
Wages of sin.
No, what does he say there?
The moment that you eat it, then.
For the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Did Adam and Eve die physically the day they ate of the fruit?
No,
Obviously
spiritually, no.
not.
We wouldn't be,
No. So therefore, the death that God was talking about, because there's people like Ken Ham that say, well, there was never any kind of death on earth prior to that.
No, but there wasn't.
Where does it say that?
Well, there was no one else except Adam and Eve, so there
Yeah.
Well,
was no
for,
other
for
death.
humans.
No death.
yeah, but what about animals?
What about animals? What about plants? So
Did they die in the garden?
what did they die? Did the animals out in the ocean die? Because why would they die if this is right?
They can't eat fruit.
Because they don't have access to the fruit. What's the thing that makes you live forever? The fruit of life. Very much like what the ancient explorers were looking for with
The fountain of youth.
the fountain of youth. This is, like I said, I preface this by saying there are a lot of people that disagree with me with that.
Is this your own hypothesis?
Yeah, it is.
This is not,
No, this is me looking at what it seems to be saying in that text. Well, can I back up one more step?
Mhm.
One of the problems that I have developed in the last 20, 25 years, basically soon after I moved here, is a real distrust of systematic theology. And a lot of places teach systematic theology. When you go to Bible school, when you go to seminary, they teach systematic theology. I have a real problem with systematic theology. Because what does systematic theology do?
Puts everything in a nice little
It
box.
conforms.
Yeah, it builds a box, and then what do you do with that box?
Put each
You make it
thing
fit.
in one area.
Yes, you make stuff fit. So you take the verses and maybe you've heard people, I've heard people say this a lot. Maybe you have too. Well, I like that verse.
Mhm. We've heard that a lot here.
I don't like that verse.
but isn't the death of, I mean, I get it. I respect you immensely.
Yeah.
So when you say something, I'm not throwing it out the window, but by the same token, I'm just thinking about this, and there was no death before Adam, and death is corruption. You know what I mean? That's what death is.
But what is the death?
The animal dies, you said.
But does an animal death count? Because if death is spiritual death, that's the death God said will happen when you eat that fruit. Not physical death.
But wouldn't it still, the animal would decay and.
But it doesn't say they wouldn't decay. It says they wouldn't, because again, what is God's view about physical death?
But it doesn't.
What is God's view about
It
physical death?
returns to the earth.
Is physical death a horrible thing from God's perspective?
Well, actually, if you look in, I think it's either Deuteronomy or Numbers, they're very specific in that you are not to be anywhere near a dead body.
Right.
That you're to be unclean.
But how about no more tears, no more sorrow? If my animal dies, I'm gonna have sorrow. Our dog just died 4 weeks ago and we're all sad
That's
about it.
very sad.
That's like 8 or 9
Um,
weeks ago.
but again, why is death, physical death happen? Because we don't have access to the tree of life.
But do you consider animals to have a spiritual life?
No,
Well, then what's the point? I would say I agree with Mike then, because there was only Adam and Eve.
Let me ask you another one to throw another twist on this thing. God created the animals and gave them to Adam to name. Okay, now, did all the animals live in the garden, or were some of the animals outside of the garden?
look at Psalm 116:15. Psalm
Which they're physically-
116.
Which then brings up the question, how
We
big
don't know how
was the
big
garden?
the garden was.
That's
Yeah.
How much
Big garden.
food was there for all the
What about the stuff like?
sea animals? Yeah, exactly.
Did Adam name them?
Yeah.
What?
Special suit.
What, Psalm 116:15,
116:15.
yeah?
116:15.
Oh, precious in the sight of the Lord. That's what I should
Precious
have thought.
in the sight of the Lord
Is the death of his saints, but
is
that's
the
the
death of
key.
his saints. So is physical death something that God says, this is horrible, this has to be prevented at all costs, this is something that I have to make sure never happens?
No, but it's only precious if you know him.
Yeah, but therefore, what God says is horrible is what? The death that happened in the Garden of Eden on the day they ate the fruit. And that is the death of total cutoff between us and God. Spiritual death.
But you said death from, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, it comes from sin, from corruption and spiritual death immediately, but physical death, it takes a while. And I mean, I think we've all had, or we're at the age where we've had someone in our family die and
Yeah.
horribly, and whether it be disease.
But again, because we have always lived in a
Sinful.
world of sin and that has colored our whole outlook on life from birth to however old we are. Every moment of that has been formed by a sinful world. How different would our thinking be if we'd grown up in absolute purity and perfection? We can't imagine that. Would there be people that would just say, I've lived long enough, I want to go home into eternity. I've lived long enough in a world of flesh. I don't know.
But there
I
are
get,
people who say that
And there are
anyway.
people that say that in the spirit, in the sinful world. But we're starting to get into very theoretical things here.
yeah,
But I think that we have to really think about what does it mean that tree of life was there, that they had available to eat at, and we don't.
Did they eat that?
And
Did.
did they eat at? Yeah, did they?
Oh, you mean maybe.
With
they
the
did.
tree of life, they
Right.
didn't eat at it.
Well, we don't know that.
That's why they were banished from the garden. which
So that they
Paul said
couldn't
at the beginning.
continue to eat at it.
you're
after
saying,
they
That
came-
doesn't
you're
it say
saying that the
less
tree
do
that
they
they
eat?
were only told to eat, not eat from one
One
tree, good and
tree.
And
evil.
doesn't he say less do they eat of it? We're putting them out of the garden.
Right, so they can't do that.
So it
So
doesn't
you're
sound like he
saying-
ever did.
Here's what you're saying is one bite of it and it lasts forever. I'm saying, when he says so they can't eat at it, that's a continuous action. They can't keep eating at it, because if they keep eating at it, they will never age and die and they'll live forever in this world.
So in the Hebrew, is it that the
It's
aorist
not, it's
tense?
not clear because
I ask your Jewish friends.
yeah. Because
be
the
interesting
Hebrew
to
there
know,
is so
because-
old.
They'll
The
probably
Hebrew there
say-
is so old that it's really hard.
They'll probably say
Probably
they
say
never
oy
eat
vey.
from it.
Oy
Yeah.
vey, yeah, exactly.
Hey, Pastor, that's
Think
one we
about
could
it.
talk all night, but I have a
Yeah.
couple questions for you, and I'll make them quick, because it just, first of all, the price of a slave was 20 pieces of silver, says over and over. Jesus was 30 pieces of silver, but what I've read is when you kill somebody's slave, if you bought somebody's slave, it'd be 20 pieces of silver, but if you killed them, you have to pay up for the
Lost.
usage that they would have gotten, the lost wages, as Jack just said. So that's why it's 30 pieces. Am I correct there?
I think, and I'd have to do research. I haven't thought about that in a very long time. But I think there was also another price involved there, and that was the price of redemption, to redeem somebody back from outside slavery.
Okay.
If they were captured and you went to, not just to free a slave, but because how were most slaves made in the ancient world?
From debt. Or
Okay.
captured?
There were two ways. Now, when we think of slavery in America, what was slavery in America linked to?
Somebody was brought over from another land.
But basically it was even more than that.
Indentured slavery?
What was slavery in the United States linked to? And in England, in the 1700s. What?
Farming?
But very fundamentally, what was the difference between slaves and free people?
The color of their skin.
The color of their skin,
As
their
the kids
race. Slavery was black people bought from Africa. Free people were whites. How many white slaves were there in America? Well, you couldn't have them. It wasn't legal. So it was all tied to race. In the ancient world, 3,000 years ago in Egypt, 2,000 years ago in Rome, it was not at all linked to race. There was no racism involved in slavery. In fact, where does the word slave come from? The English word.
Slavic? I mean,
Yes. From Slav. As in the
Czechoslovak.
Slovakia, the area of Eastern Europe that was the Slavic peoples. Why is the word Slav the word slave in English? Because the vast majority of slaves in the later Middle Ages were white. The vast majority of slave owners and sellers throughout the Middle Ages were
White.
Muslim. The Muslims were the largest slave traders in the Western world by
Yeah,
far.
But that's after a certain time, right? Islam didn't even come in.
And I said in the Middle Ages,
Oh, in the middle, okay.
the time that our societies were,
Did they come in around 600 AD,
Yes.
something like that? Okay.
yes. But by 1000 AD, they had a monopoly on slaves. They would buy captured blacks in Africa, sell them around the world. They would raid up through modern day Turkey into Slavia, into the area of Czechoslovakia, that Eastern European area, capture people, bring them down, enslave them, and then sell them throughout the rest of the world,
Both black and white.
both black and white. The only exception was other Muslims.
Yeah.
They weren't allowed to enslave Muslims. Other than that, boom.
Okay.
So,
Yep.
in their slavery, what were the two ways that a person became a slave? It had nothing to do with race.
Indenture, I mean, if you owe money,
Uh,
more.
Or because money, owing money became what? And in America and England, they outlawed it. Became a crime. Me owing you money became a crime. So therefore you could arrest me for owing you money. And then I would be sold into slavery to pay you back. And they made that illegal in the United States, part of our Constitution. Can't do that.
Wait, what, did you like even have any time to pay the person back, or as soon as you owed someone money, you had to go?
Well, theoretically, at any time that you owed them money, they could collect on that. So owing people money was a very dangerous thing to do.
So is being obligated to them, like
Yeah.
for passage to the country, is that considered owing money, or is that the other you're looking for?
So that this whole thing, it's a little bit more than owing money, it's criminal behavior. So if I did something that was a crime that wasn't worthy of death, but I just couldn't be fined for it, sell them into slavery, you don't have to worry about it anymore.
If I broke your window and it was an extreme cost and I had the money, yeah, I could be a slave.
If you raped my daughter.
Yeah, but I mean, I could, if I stole
Something like
something,
that.
I could be a slave until I pay that off.
No, once you became a slave, you were a slave.
Oh, really?
It's not just
So-
indentured.
Oh,
You're-
okay.
Wow.
you're a slave.
You didn't agree for a certain period of time to do it.
Right.
So, that way you all.
Now, in Israel, of course, there were the laws to release slaves, but they never practiced it, which is
Jubilee.
why God took them
Yeah.
into captivity for
Because they
70
started to do it right, and then they stopped. it.
stopped right away.
Is that Jubilee?
Yes,
Yeah.
the second way was warfare.
Yeah, I was gonna say war and capture.
If there's two nations at war, they have a big battle, they kill some of the people, not very many, because their weapons didn't kill the way, a carpet bombing does. What would mostly happen is their morale would break, they'd start to run, they'd capture a whole bunch of people. Now, what do you do with them?
Make them slaves.
You make them slaves. But before you make them slaves, what do you do?
Had to break them.
You offer to have them be, what's the word? Redeemed.
Ooh.
Either their nation, the king, or their family
Could buy them back.
can buy them back out of that slavery. So that's where this idea of redemption, that biblical word, comes from that transaction. And 30 pieces of silver was for a common footman, was a pretty standard price for just an ordinary guy that was in the military, not an officer, not a champion.
Okay. I thought I read in a few places, and I'll have to check it out again, but I thought it said the price of a slave was
Well, that-
20, and then if you killed him, like Jack said, you're
That
paying
would
for
very
that.
well be as well.
All right.
But remember, when you're redeeming someone, that's not going to the market to buy a slave. There's a premium on that because you don't want just a slave. You want this particular person. And it's a seller's market because you want the person that I've captured.
And
You don't just want anybody where we can haggle price. You want this guy right here.
What are you willing to pay?
Exactly. Second question.
One other quick question. I heard a Bible teacher just the other day talk about, he was saying when Abraham committed adultery with Hagar. And I think what he was saying is about even, but, isn't
No.
marrying more than one
No.
back in those days? It was, if you married her, it was your wife, then it wasn't considered adultery. You could
Not at
have,
all.
you could have, okay, just wanted to find
But,
out.
but beyond that, what was the only code of law that they had available in Abraham's time?
Hammurabi?
Code of Hammurabi. Wasn't fully articulated yet. Hammurabi's even late, is more modern than that. But it was being built at that point and coming together. What does the Code of Hammurabi say about a barren wife?
She could have children through other, just like they did, children through your
What
slave or.
The Code of Hammurabi eventually codifies. This was the common thinking in the Middle East, was that if a woman couldn't provide an heir, a child, for her husband, she would offer one of her maidservants. And that when that child was born,
She would accept it as hers.
the moment that child was born,
It's hers.
it was not the maid's, but the wife's. So therefore, when Sarah says, take my handmaiden,
She would follow it.
she was following the rules of the day. When Abraham agrees with her and does it, he was
Following the law.
following the law. Was he committing adultery?
No.
No.
So why didn't she take Ishmael as hers then?
Well, where does the problem come in? And there's a couple of problems there.
What did God promise?
Hagar doesn't give up the custody of him. And there's this huge rivalry
Attitude.
between
Mhm, right.
the two of them over this child. But second of all, and far more importantly,
So that's the fulfillment of God's promise,
Yeah.
like you just said, right?
but more importantly, it's not about what Abraham and Sarah, or even Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar do. There's a fourth person in this, and who's the fourth
The
person?
Lord,
The Lord. And what is God's attitude towards Ishmael?
Get rid of
you're not what I planned.
them.
So there's a spiritual lesson here, and it's very important for the church today. Because the attitude in the church for the last 25, 30 years that I've been watching this has been, God told us to do something. We've got a great humanistic way to do it. We've got all these psychological tools. We can have altar calls, every head bowed, every eye closed, no one looking around. Raise your hand with nobody seeing. Okay, once you get them to make that step, get them to stand up. Once they get them to come forward, psychologically it works.
That's Ishmael.
That's Ishmael. Ishmael is human effort trying to bring about God's promise. God says, I reject Ishmael. You can't fulfill my promise by your methods and means. So what does God do?
He gives him his own nation and everything.
That's true, but what does God do about his promise?
He still fulfills
He
it
still
through
fulfills
Isaac.
And unpack that. How does God fulfill his promise? Through
Originally, he said, right.
through a, one word,
Woman,
miracle.
Miracle.
He takes a almost 100-year-old woman and has her get pregnant, carry, and bear a child. Is that a natural occurrence?
Yeah.
With all of our medical technology today, is that a medically feasible situation?
Yeah.
No.
Even if she could have the child, the chances that she would survive the birth of the child.
So therefore, how does God fulfill his promise? Through
miraculous.
a
Miracle.
miracle.
So that's the same probably for Hannah and also obviously for Elizabeth.
Yeah,
So who bears most of the brunt of the problems in the Middle East, since that was Ishmael's inheritance? Was it,
and,
was it,
but it's
was
not
it
just,
Sarah?
it's not
Or
just,
was it Abraham for?
but it's not just
waiting on
Ishmael.
God?
Who else is, where else does the problems in the Middle East come from? Because there's another generation involved,
Jacob and Esau.
Jacob and Esau, and a
True,
lot of the people in the Middle East are the Esau
Yeah.
generation. So,
Yeah.
you know, at each point, there's that.
And you have their fraction against each other.
But if you go back to the Isaac and Ishmael one,
But
when
because
we
Ishmael
tried-
was sent out first, that
Yeah.
was before Esau.
but when we try to serve God our way, what happens?
Bad things.
Bad
You reap what
things.
you sow.
And again, how many generations are those bad
Still
things?
paying for it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and we were talking about this in Sunday school class. Remember, what is the Old Testament? Every part of the Old Testament, and here I'm talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where he says this. 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to, what is it? 1 to what? Uh, 1 to 6. I'm
Oh,
sorry,
as
no,
examples for us?
1 to 11.
Yeah, that they all have
One to
as
11.
examples and warnings.
The entire Old Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 11, were examples. How are they examples? Important spiritual principle. How are they examples?
What not to do.
Well, they are,
Oh,
and he
there were
gives
some-
those.
there were some
But
cases-
how are they, how does God use them to make examples? What allows them to be examples?
The final outcome, is.
The
usually-
fact that he plays it out in the physical realm. So that we can see it. If God simply says, serving me by natural means doesn't work, you have to serve me through my means, we go, okay, yeah, and ignore it. But when God draws a picture of two children who were born, one by the person saying, okay, this is what I'm gonna do because it's the right thing to do. That's what everybody agrees. So I'll use that because that must be what God means. And God says, nope. I'll do it through a miracle. And what's the outcome? Generations of hatred and yada, yada, yada. God, instead of simply saying something that we go, I don't get it, he draws us a picture that slaps us in the face. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So instead of God saying, hey, I can help you overcome any problem. I can help you overcome losing a job. I can help you overcome a problem in your home. I can help you overcome. No, he says, there was this little kid who shows up to bring his brother some lunch. And there was this 7.5 foot guy there, screaming and hollering at them, towering over them, 1.5 times as tall as anybody around him. And everybody was quaking, and he says, I don't care how big that giant is, I'll bring him down because God's on my side. Does that mean that if I have to go out and fight a 7 or 8 foot or 10 foot guy tomorrow, that's what that story's about?
Right, you're supposed to bring a slingshot and some stones.
Yeah. Or is that,
Not a slingshot.
yeah, a sling.
A sling.
Is that what that's about? Because I don't think I'm gonna fight any 9 foot guys today, or 8.5 foot guys tomorrow.
The principle.
Do you see how it takes a physical situation to picture it for a spiritual reality? And throughout the entire Old Testament, everything is based in the physical. So who are the enemies? Well, the Bible says that the real enemies we fight are what?
Spiritual.
Spiritual, not flesh and blood. They're demons. And wickedness and lies and deceptions.
It takes a physical situation, you said,
Yeah,
to what?
to illustrate spiritual truths.
Illustrate spiritual.
Hmm.
Is this all from your training from those navigators?
Some of it,
I better get that. I better take the course.
some of it. And it wasn't a course, it was guys who had learned this stuff in the navigators that were doing exactly what we're doing here. So why does God do all this stuff with Isaac and Esau?
To show us.
To illustrate this spiritual point. And again, he takes 2,000 years to do that. Because if you start with the story, where does Old Testament history begin? What is the beginning of Old Testament history?
With Abraham.
Abraham and Job.
Yeah.
2,000 years BC. Are there true stories from previous to that?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Oh, certainly. The flood,
Mhm.
creation, the Garden of Eden. But what are all of them?
Prehistory?
Prehistory. Can we date where they fall in history? No. And if, with respect to Usher and his 4004 BC, you can't do that. Why? Even from the biblical
There's
going
no
through the
records-
genealogies.
No records of it?
Don't have a starting point.
Because you don't know how many generations are skipped. That term begat, that's translated in the King James begat, is descendant of, not
Like, is he the father or
child
the
of-
grandfather or the
or
great
great
Yeah.
grandfather. And we don't know how many generations have been skipped in between there.
Sort of like the rabbits in the yard, you
Yeah.
know?
With Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, we're
We-
sure three
We're
generations.
sure those three are, yes, because we have their whole story. But when it just goes through a list of 45 names,
Who knows?
and there's a reason that happened.
Because 1,000 years ago, there's somebody in Eastern Europe that begat you,
Right,
and who knows?
but there's a reason why. How did they keep those genealogies? They didn't have books that they wrote them in.
It's a wood stake, isn't it?
The staff of the clan,
Yeah.
and you would start on the bottom of the staff with Abraham, who's the founder of the clan.
God
And over
forbid.
at Isaac, and then
forbid.
Jacob, and you go up the staff. But what happens very quickly with that staff?
You wear out space.
You run out of space. What do you do when you run out of space with the staff?
Start a new one.
Reader's Digest.
You can't just start a new one and throw the old one away, because why is it that I am entitled to be the head of the clan?
Order of the staff.
You just take the important one.
Because I am the direct descendant of whoever is at the bottom of that staff, Abraham. So when Luke says, who's Jesus? Son of Abraham. Son of Adam. When Matthew says, who's Jesus? Son of Abraham, son of David. But if I just put all the names back on the staff,
Round again.
then I'm out of room again. So what do?
Abbreviate.
I get rid of all the names that don't matter.
On the man.
Here's, and Bob Jr. and Bob the Third and Bob the Fourth, and not a single Bob did anything. Guess what happens to Bob's name on the staff?
Bye.
He's gone. So now I take that staff that's full to the top with previous generations and I reduce it down to maybe half or a third of the staff, and I start adding again. Well, what happens when it gets full?
Start again.
Yeah.
Again, how many staffs did they go through in 2,000 years between Abraham, or even the 600 years between Abraham and Moses?
Mhm.
And that's why those things, that's why we don't know how many generations were skipped in that.
I don't cotton to that, I'm sorry.
Okay,
It's also, you know, what struck me more than anything else when I started out my chronological Bible this past time was that, you know, we always think, you know, like you hear Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but that's not the order. Japheth was not the youngest of the three, and I don't remember which one was now, but I remember it's a totally different order because I got to something else and it said, and Japheth was, you know, like the older
right,
brother.
he's the oldest, yeah.
Yeah, and I was shocked, and then I went back and read it like 3 more times. And it's definitely in that order. I mean, you know, in a different
But
way.
why is Shem first?
I don't know.
Because he's the father of the
Oh,
Middle Eastern people that
Oh,
the Jews
okay.
came from.
The line.
Hmm.
So he's
Chosen
part
line.
of the line.
Yeah, so he would be on that stick
So,
real prominent.
right.
Yeah, it's
exactly.
amazing, but it just blew my mind when I saw that.
The problem with that, if you don't do that, then the Bible can't be right. Because how much history do we know existed in the world?
Was documented.
But how much is documented?
You don't know?
Oh, we do, because we have histories from around the world.
Yeah.
China has a written history that goes back at least 7, maybe 10,000 years. There were people all the way in China 10,000 years ago. So if the world was created 4,000 years before Christ, 6,000 years ago,
Where did the Chinese live?
Well, what calendar did they go by, or how did they, do you know, like,
they have their own calendar. It's got a name for it. but it goes back.
Was it 360 or 65 days that count?
Oh, yeah, pretty close. It may not be the half day. The Jewish calendar is 360 days. That's what screws them all up, because, you know, when you're losing 5 days a year instead of half a day or quarter a day.
By the time you're 70, the
Yeah,
whole-
it's
it's
all
all-
around the
it's
block.
all flipped around.
Yeah. So that's where, again, understanding their culture, was that a problem for them? See, for us, in our culture, the way we keep records, that's a problem. For them, was that a problem?
Yeah, but did Moses, who wrote the books, who wrote the genealogies in there, did he go back and look at these things, or was that inspired, the writing? Do you know what I mean? That's
Both.
where,
Both. God uses sources,
I would think that.
because if you look at the Gospels, were the Gospels inspired?
Yes.
Anybody gonna challenge that here?
No,
No.
Did the Gospels use sources?
Yes.
sure.
Yeah. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. Which gospel's written first?
Mark,
Mark. And what two gospels used Mark as a pattern?
Matthew and Luke.
Matthew and Luke. But both of them use him differently. But again, they used sources. And Luke admits that. What does Luke say in the beginning of the book of Luke?
That he set out to, you know, to
That
write
he-
the history.
that-
the-
After having been,
Check all the facts.
yeah,
Yeah.
after having done research into the facts, I have put down in a logical order what actually happened.
But Moses never says that.
No, he doesn't.
And the Jewish people don't even believe he wrote the first 5 books, but how I would say we know it is, Jesus says that he wrote the first 5 books. So the books of Moses.
Jesus said he gave the first 5 books.
That's different than writing them.
Because even throughout, as you get toward the end of Deuteronomy, what does it say in there? And they're hidden throughout a lot of the things, but you'll see these verses. And so went to the land of Canaan, and there he built an altar, and they called it Hallel. And that is its name
Till
Till this
today.
day.
unto this day.
Yeah,
Now, what does that tell you?
At the time they wrote it.
But the fact that he's saying, and that's what it's called to this day. If he's describing what happened, is he writing it that day, or is he writing it later than that?
Later than that, than it happened.
yeah.
Yeah,
That
right.
means he'd be able to predict the.
because I wouldn't say, you know, Joe Biden, dedicated a monument to whatever on Tuesday, November 28th, 2023, and called it Biden's Monument. And that's what it's called until today,
Have a good night.
right?
Doesn't make sense.
Or even if I was writing that next week, I wouldn't say that.
Right. It would be,
But a historian, you know, 10 years or 20 years from now would say that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So again, how was the book of Deuteronomy, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Genesis, how were they generally put down in Moses' day? They were memorized, word for word. We go, oh, that doesn't work, that's whisper down the lane. That's because we don't exercise our brains
We don't need
to remember things properly. Because what do we do with things we want to remember?
write it down.
But when you have a pre-literate society, guess what?
It's all.
Yeah.
word.
Yeah,
They learn to memorize it.
Sort of like the same way folk songs pass down so much history.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
God gave Moses a whole bunch of songs to.
Yep.
To help them remember.
That's true, yeah, yeah.
So. A
And
lot of times,
there's all that rehearsing too, like of, you know, over and over and over
Yep.
about the horses and the riders and the
Yep.
sea and all that stuff. It shows up a zillion times.
Yep. And again, that's all part of that, how do you say that word?
I
Mnemonic.
forget,
Mnemonic?
yeah, mnemonic, I think.
Mnemonic, whatever.
Mnemonic.
Yeah. That to help you remember those things.
Hmm.
We want a simple, God grabbed the guy's arm and did this. The miracle of the Bible is that God did it so much more complicated than that. And still at the end of the day,
There's no
we can say
contradiction.
what? This is
Word of
The
God.
word of
the
God,
word of God.
yeah.
And we don't have to defend something that isn't true just to make it simpler. We can say God used all these means, but at the end of the day, this is the word of God.
Mhm.
And if you doubt it, look at it, study it, and you'll see how wondrous it is.
Got it.
God bless.
Old American.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. Later, everybody.
Hey, good night, everybody.
Night, everybody.
Bye.